Hello, and welcome to the My Spiritual Friends podcast. I'm your host, Joni Lorraine. And here at My Spiritual Friends, we delve into our spiritual journeys and discover how sharing these experiences with others can lead to personal growth and flourishing. This season, we're shining a light on the spiritual lives of the LGBTQ+ community. We'll explore what it means to be both spiritual and gay, and discuss how we can build connections that support the unique and authentic spiritual needs of this incredible community. If you find value in the conversation today, please like and subscribe to the podcast. Your support means the world to me. And for more insights and resources, visit my website at jonilorraine.com and subscribe to my Substack at spiritualdirection.substack.com. If you feel inspired to contribute, I gratefully accept your donations at buymeacoffee.com/Joni Lorraine. Enough of that. Now let's embark on this journey together. I invite you to sit alongside me as we visit with my spiritual friends. Well, good day, everyone. We are so grateful you are here on My Spiritual Friends with us. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Gena St. David, a member of the faculty and important part of my alma mater, Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas. And Gena serves as the director of the Center for Counseling and Spirituality and professor of counselor education at Seminary of the Southwest, as I said, here in Austin. And she is a licensed professional counselor supervisor and licensed marriage and family therapist supervisor, specializing in systemic therapies, trauma resilience, and neuroscience, or into the brain, into the soul, into the body, into the emotions. Gena has also authored multiple publications on advocacy for LGBTQ+ individuals and relationships. And that's why we're really grateful she's here this season. She has worked on recovery from religious trauma and the neuroscience of spirituality and nonviolence, including the brain and the spirit. Her latest project is a search for neuroscientific ways and keys for unlocking nonviolence toward animals, the planet, and humankind. What a difference you make. Hi, Gena.
Hi, Joey. I'm so glad to be here with you.
So, Gena, why do you do what you do?
Oh gosh, I was just recently at a really cool conference that has nothing to do with my field. It was an animal law conference, and I was sitting in a room with advocates for animal welfare, and so I got this question a few different ways, a few different times, like tell us more about who you are, and like why are you here, and then why is this something you're interested in when it's not even your field and it's not what you get paid to do. But I think that the way that I approach my work as a therapist and an educator and a researcher and a writer and an advocate is always fueled at some level by an interest in nonviolence. I think that interest goes back to my childhood, and like many of us, I was witness to on the receiving end of some degree of violence growing up, and in a way that I always, from a young age, understood that human beings have this capacity to do violence to ourselves and other people and animals in the environment, and some part of us doesn't want to. And so when we do, it's often because it's like against our highest values. And so I think I've just always been interested in like, how do we help ourselves and each other to embody an ethic of nonviolence, even under stress, when our bodies and our nervous systems will hijack us, our brainstem will hijack us and short circuit even our best intentions. And so if you had to put an umbrella theme over every part of my work in the world, it's about that question. That's some of even this conversation we're having today.
To see Gena's face is to see compassion and joy and love. And that is rooted for so many of us in spirituality. And I suspect it's rooted in your spiritual experience as well, Gena. You want to tell us anything about that?
Sure. I had a profound, what I would consider a spiritual experience when I was around 12 years old. And my mother was newly single, and she was an elementary school teacher. She worked really hard. Prior to those years, our family had experienced violence and loss and grief. And so my family now, when I was 12, was my mom was a single mom. I was the oldest, and my younger brother and sister were in the home, and it was a frightening time. And I think oldest children can often identify this. Yeah, I just worried about everybody. And my mom worked really hard. She was a wonderful, loving mom, and she took us down the street to this little Methodist neighborhood church in a brown brick building. And what I experienced there in that church was that these people loved my mom, and they loved us. And there was something about being in that community that gave me a sense of comfort, like we might be okay. And so because of that experience, I started listening really carefully to the way people in that community talked about their reason for being there, the way they talked about spirituality, the way they talked about God, the way they talked about prayer. And I started reading scripture alone in my bedroom, often at night, sometimes with my mom, hearing her cry down the hall because life was hard in those years. And I would light a candle and I would read. I had a Bible where all the words of Jesus were in red. So I just read the words in red, and I would write my thoughts, prayers, poems, and I felt a tangible experience of comfort, being loved, that maybe we're not alone in this grief. And that started me off trying to understand, if I could have that experience at age 12, who else is having that experience? How does that experience happen for people? How can I help other people have that kind of comforting experience? And then when I was in faith communities later on, that where that was not the experience,
Right.
I wanted to understand that and square that theologically, scripturally, socially. And so that's some of my faith background. So I did spend quite a number of years in more evangelical communities where that kind of trust, I'm going to put the word trust on that, like neurobiological experience I was having at age 12. And the experience in a number of other faith communities, it was more of an experience of mistrust, or being taught not to trust what was happening inside me. So that curiosity has become an interest of mine. Why does that sometimes emerge in faith communities and theological structures, is the idea of not being able to trust yourself and your feelings, or and not creating trustworthy relationships. But when we are able to experience spirituality in a way that sparks trust for us, I understand now as a therapist and someone who's steeped in neuroscience, it just unleashes all of that wonderful, the neurotransmitters and the psychological goodness that we're wired to experience as human beings. That's like all the goodness of being alive. And through trust and spirituality, it can be a really effective vehicle for that.
Some of the things you said in your bio in terms of your spiritual experience brought me to the idea of spiritual formation. And I've invited you here not just because you are an outstanding, a wonderful person who I want everyone to know about, but because you know things about transgender folks, gender identity, and I don't know what you know. And those things have an effect on our spiritual formation. And for those of us in the alphabet gang, we have a unique need to be heard in certain kinds of ways, for people to understand us in certain kinds of ways. And I just want to step into this and ask you, how would you define gender identity in a way that might help those of us who are unfamiliar with the concept about what it is?
Yeah. Well, first off, I so appreciate this conversation. I think it's extremely timely, especially for those of us in certain states right now with legislation taking place.
Yes. Yes.
And so, and I will preface this by saying I am no means an expert in gender and sexuality. And so I'm speaking as a cisgender person. What I have learned about gender identity and diversity has come much from listening humbly and with a real desire to trust and understand each individual's lived experience, and then going into the literature and trying to understand where the biology and neuroscience is helping us make sense of the diversity of lived experiences. So I'll share what I have come to understand and appreciate that's helped me really delight in the diversity of humankind. And there's just so many gifts in that. And so we can think about gender as being informed in part by anatomy. So just the physical reproductive organs and traits. And then gender identity is more of a self experience that has a psychological component, physical component, social component. And then gender expression is the outward manifestation of that may or may not align with the inner experience for lots of reasons. And then the perception of others externally onto that person of how they perceive. We all exist somewhere on a scale from what socially we would consider masculine traits, or socially we might consider feminine traits. We all exist on some spectrum of that. And then there's the level of like chromosomes and genes that require a DNA testing to be able to ascertain. And I think all of those are an important part of this conversation, particularly because living here in the state of Texas, there's been conversation recently even about the DPS was trying to comply with the governor's office around coming up with procedures for when to allow someone to change their gender marker on their driver's license. And there had been talk about requiring a chromosome test, which I hope we'll get to talk about some today, because the science, as I understand it, I'm not a biologist, but I just really tried to stay very on top of the current research. And my understanding from the biologists is that there's so much more happening than even just chromosomes. So even if we could determine somebody's XX chromosome or XY chromosome, or then there's combinations of three like XXY, that wouldn't be enough to tell us from an outside external perspective what someone's gender identity is. And so it really comes down to, do we trust the person, and do we trust that we are each experts on ourselves, and why or why not? And I think that is very much informed by spirituality and theology sometimes, as well as cultural teaching. So that's maybe a large frame for the conversation.
I think the LGBTQ community are the people who can lead the rest of us in our own experience of wholeness by being very clear about who we are in the face of a bunch of people who think they know better. And it's more pervasive than I want it to be, about what I can do with my body, what I can say about who I am. And I don't know where I'm going with this other than to express it and to say I'm glad you do what you do, and that we have an ally in you. And is there anything else you might want to say about what's going on?
Well, to say one more thing about even that question when it comes up around chromosomes, and if there could be some sort of like definitive external test that is aside from the question of like, why are we not trusting people? But even just like to go into the biology of it, what I've come to understand, Joni, is that on like, for instance, on each X chromosome, like so all every embryo starts with as an XX, and then like there's a Y chromosome added about 50% of the time from the father, from the sperm. And even on the X chromosomes, there's still about 1,500 individual smaller genes, and each of those genes determines some sort of trait or physical expression or manifestation along all the spectrum of human traits. And some of those are we consider to be like sex traits, like hair growth and tone of voice and muscular stature and size of hands, and just these different markers that tell us like if somebody is even identifying male but has more maybe feminine traits, or is identifying female but has more masculine traits. It has to do with all of these tiny, smaller genes, and there's about 1,500 on the X chromosome. They're guessing about 500 on the Y chromosome. And there's these ways in which these proteins are responsible for going through as the embryo is developing and turning on or off all these other little genes. And that is entirely to try to maximize the health of the embryo. And so each of those little genes, even though like this one might have to do with hair growth, it also, each of those genes contains some sort of propensity for hereditary disease or not. And so they're trying to turn off genes that have some sort of bad propensity for some sort of disease and turn on the genes that are maximizing health. So however that embryo then ends up developing and becoming as a human being is the optimal, healthiest version that set of DNA possibly could produce. And so that may end up being somebody who has an XY chromosome combination, or these certain anatomical traits, and also these other like feminine or masculine traits and psychological identity. It all is one package that maximizes the health of that combination of DNA. And so I think that's just fascinating, the like complexity of human development and the purpose behind it.
I've thought for a long time, before we knew any of this, that none of us would be particularly straight or heterosexual if it hadn't been imposed on us. We would actually be able to explore having a choice in the matter. This next generation is so gender fluid because they don't have a culture telling them they have to be a certain way. So we have succeeded somewhere. They're the leaders in this. And even those of us in the queer community were not appreciative of transgender folks in the 90s and the late 80s, and probably well before that. I think eventually the alphabet gang will be all of the alphabet. There won't be anything separate. That's the goal. There's no separation there.
Well, it's such a inspiring vision for the world that you're putting out there. And because there are so many benefits to diversity, maximizing the diversity and people's freedom to express our individuality authentically only makes us collectively stronger.
Yes, and that is, in your explanation, it is clear that it is not just spiritually or relationally stronger. Our diversity is scientifically what makes us stronger. That diversity makes us stronger. So what do you perceive to be the misconceptions that we have about gender identity?
Well, I think thinking about gender identity on too narrow of a binary, scale, I think is one misconception, that the biology is just really helping us shift that paradigm. And then our own, if we're really honest with ourselves and our own lived experience, it just really helps us see how expansive our own gender ideas and expression and identity are. And so having the idea that it serves human beings to try to force each of us into one of just two narrow gender categories and roles, there's just no compelling evidence that's helpful. So the evidence is entirely in the other direction.
Gotcha. So our brothers and sisters who see that way, see that there are binaries. What